All right. All right, folks, so we're recording, but I am gonna spotlight John so that he'll be the main speaker in the video. And if folks want to turn on your cameras, please, go ahead. I just have a couple of questions for John about sort of how he got into watchmaking, or maybe really just we could start with how you got into watches and then what got you into watchmaking. We'll talk a little about your choice to go with Cornell Watch Company, your partnership with Roland Murphy, and then I'm really curious to hear about your project for supporting American watchmaking. I was listening recently to an interview with Joshua Shapiro from J and Shapiro Watches, and he was talking about how he's making efforts to try to source all of like his hairsprings and everything here in the US, and finding, like Bulova apparently had like a jewel making factory, and I think it's like Missouri or somewhere where I didn't know. And so rescuing some of the leftovers from that. So that got me thinking about the work that you're doing with trying to support American watchmaking. All right, so let's see. I think we should get started. Since we just have a few folks here, I'm going to give everyone a chance to just introduce themselves, just say hello and say your name, and then we'll toss it over to Josh. I'm sorry, we'll toss it over to John to start the program. I see Jürgen.
Take myself off mute here. Hey, what's going on? I'm Jürgen. Been with RedBar probably a year or two here. I collect mostly vintage, but have kind of familiarized myself with what you guys do. It looks super cool. Happy to learn more.
Good to meet you.
Good to meet you. Thank you, Jürgen. Roger, our kind of what would your title be, Roger, with regards to RedBar? You're like our
I'm the local chapter chair, I guess.
chapter chair.
That's the best title. But thanks for doing this. Thanks for coming.
Of course, happy to be here.
And we have TB. TB says, apologies, my audio isn't working, but happy to be here and listen on the conversation. All right, so great. And how long have I been with RedBar? I think I've been with RedBar for maybe 2 years. Maybe a little under 2 years. I don't know. I don't know if Roger keeps track of that. But John, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I was telling John that maybe we caught him early because, when I started reading about him, I felt like, well, this could, he could get really busy if all of this starts taking off, and it'll be great to get him while we can. So welcome. And I'm going to start off with just asking, I noticed that you weren't wearing a watch, so I'm not going to start with what's on your wrist.
Yeah, I've got it here. I've got the Cornell here.
Okay.
But my daily wear is actually a Grand Seiko. I've got the spring version, which I love. It was a gift to me. But I do wear the Cornell a lot. In fact, I actually was wearing the Cornell on rubber for the longest time, which sounds like kind of crazy, but I would wear it to like events and travel. And right now we have it on a gator strap. So the rubber actually worked really well. But yeah, so normally I wear a Grand Seiko. I collect a lot of vintage, mainly pocket watches, which we'll talk about. But I've got the Cornell here. It's just not on my wrist.
Nice, nice. And tell us a little bit about how you got into watches.
Yeah, so when I was in college, I went to college in Chicago, in Hyde Park, where the original Cornell Watch Factory used to be. And I actually, in fact, lived, as luck would have it, I lived on Cornell Avenue. And so at the time, I had received watches as gifts. I had a bunch of G-Shocks. I had a Seiko. I had a Seiko Turtle. I had an Orca from Citizen. And so I had like some funky dive watches. I had some cheaper G-Shocks, which I love and I still collect. And I was starting to get into watches. Frankly, a lot of the watches that I liked as a college kid are really kind of out of your price range once you get outside of like the Seikos and the G-Shocks and stuff. So I really enjoyed the hunt. I enjoyed collecting. And so I got into pocket watches. And I quickly realized that the Cornell Watch Company was only a few miles south of where I was living originally. And at the time, in the 1870s, they were making some of the most precise railroad pocket watches in the world. And they had an absolute all-star cast of people involved with the company, which we can talk about. And so I started collecting them. A lot of them I would get in like estate sales. You would get them in bundles, right? Where you buy like 10 pocket watches and then there's just one in there. They're relatively rare. There was only around 16 to 18,000 ever made. And today there's only a fraction that have survived, at least reference numbers that have been kept track of. And so I used to be able to pick them up pretty easily. Nowadays, they're getting actually kind of expensive. I don't know if it's because we launched the company or what it may be, but I recently picked up a parts watch the other day and it was $500, which is crazy. Like 10 years ago, I mean, they were selling for $300 to $500, or the top grades, the 19 jewel models, maybe a few thousand, but now it's gotten kind of crazy. So it's a long-winded way of saying I started collecting Cornells when I was in college. I love the history. I could talk for days about the history of the Cornell Watch Company in Chicago and the influence they had on American and global watchmaking. And I just kept doing it until one day I thought, well, you know, I can't carry these around. They're 18 size pocket watches, are 150 years old. All the pocket watches I collect, I think we may have the largest collection of Cornells. My wife hates me for it, but when they come up, we buy them. I love them. We have almost every grade, but you can't carry them around day to day for multiple reasons, right? So we contacted Roland Murphy, and it really was just a project for friends and family at first. We just wanted to create 5 timepieces. I had my family all collects Cornells too, and we just wanted a watch we could wear every day. That was true to the ethos of the original Cornell Watch Company. So Grand Fu enamel dials, fired blued hands, hand finishing. And we wanted to work with, obviously, an American producer. So we prototyped for over 2 years. And again, it was just meant to be a limited run of 5. And so timing didn't really matter. We didn't really care about like if we went an extra month or whatever it may be. We actually had to go back to the drawing board more than once and have a total like restart. And we popped out with a watch that we were really proud of. Roland was really proud of, and he kind of gave us a nudge and said, "Hey guys, you guys have a great timepiece." He was getting good feedback. We were getting good feedback. And that's when we decided to turn the switch on and say, okay, maybe we could sell a few of these. Maybe people are interested in what we're doing in terms of reviving the original Cornell Watch Company. Maybe they're interested in the design, the quality of the watch. And we've been really fortunate with the reception we've gotten. And I'll say that it's also taught me and the team that good design and a quality watch also gives you a stage to have a voice to say something, right? So we now have the stage. What are we going to do with it? Our watch is very low volume for multiple reasons. One being the enamel's handmade. Our movements take 6 to 8 months to make, then they're hand finished. RGM hand assembles every watch. So it's not a watch where we could make 1,000 of them, at least in the current configuration of the company, right? So if we're not selling that many watches, but we have a platform, what are we going to do with it, right? And so that's where we started doing the initiatives of $500 a watch to scholarships. That's where, and we can talk about the Watchmakers of America directory that we're putting together. That's where we've talked to watchmakers like Josh Shapiro and talked to him about what can we be doing now that we have a platform to help American watchmaking. And so that's where we are now. And that's why I love speaking with groups like yourself, just because it's a process that's iterative. It's a process that we rely on other people's input to help shape what we're doing. So that's kind of where we are now. That's where it started. It was very like humble beginnings. It stemmed, and I still love the pocket watches and I collect them. But it started with the pocket watches, and now we are down a rabbit hole. And my wife Chrissy, she helps run the company with me. My roommate from college, who also went to U Chicago, that lived with me on Cornell. He also runs a company with us, Garrison Jones. And we've got a good team of advisors that make sure we don't spend too much money. So that's kind of where we are now. Oh, Rodrigo, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thanks for that. It kind of like brings us up to sort of where you are now from where you started. It's a fascinating story. I think, you know, for all of us who live in Boston, I have Howard Street right 2 blocks from my house, which is where the original Waltham factory was and where the old Howard factory was before everybody moved to Waltham. We have members of the group who live in Waltham across from the factories, and people who work in the factory, which has now been converted to offices. And so we kind of, I think, all can appreciate that, feeling that connection to the history and having that fascination, right? Especially because, like you said, the influence and the impact that it had, and all of a sudden, like it being gone, when you discover it, you're like, oh my God, what? And they did what? It's fascinating. Okay, so you took inspiration from the connection with Cornell, where you live, the watches, and but I'm curious to find out a little bit about, okay, so how were you able to then say, we're going to be Cornell Watch Company now? Like, does it not belong? Did the name not belong? Was in public domain? Like, what was that process like?
Yeah. So this is where, you know, starting a company like this, that's one of many like hurdles that you kind of have to get over. Where my background, I'm an attorney by day. And so a lot of this stuff was like out of my wheelhouse. And so when we first started, the Cornell Watch Company, no one owned the rights to it, interestingly enough. And so one of the first things we did before we even decided to make it a company, just to be safe, was we trademarked the name. And so we own the full trademark to the Cornell Watch Company. It was public domain. The only expenses were hiring a good attorney to make sure we did it right and didn't, you know, mess it up. But yeah, it was as simple as that. It was really, and you know, the other thing too is we talked to a lot of people about the history of American watchmaking, and people are like, how were you able to, you know, get such a storied brand? You know, like how was it in the public domain? And that's the interesting thing about American watchmaking. There are dozens of brands that are now gone that may have been in your backyard, all over the United States, truly from Boston all the way to San Francisco. And many of them people don't know about. And the only way you know about them is if you were shopping on eBay, you know, looking for vintage pocket watches, or you were a nerd and were in the stacks at the HSNY headquarters, right? So the Cornell Watch Company, there was not a ton of attention on it prior to us bringing it back.
On that note, I've read some books about the history of Waltham, and my takeaway from everything that I've read is that at some point their strategy started working against them, which is try to make the cheapest and the most, you know, watches. It was a losing game at that point. It was like a war of attrition against themselves. Did something similar happen with Cornell, where they were also trying to jump on that bandwagon of how can we make a cheaper watch and sort of those efficiencies, or were they more focused in like high grade watches only?
That's a great question. And your comment about Waltham, someone that's also in our backyard, or used to be, the Elgin Watch Company, Waltham and Elgin were in a dead heat to try to beat each other on pricing. And at the time, my understanding is they didn't have the same kind of corporate laws that we have today, where you could kind of collude on pricing, where you can't do that now. And so it was kind of a game of like prisoner's dilemma, where they would undercut each other. And ultimately, the Swiss were able to step in for a number of reasons, mainly due to the wars and due to tariffs. And but yeah, arguably Waltham and Elgin put each other out of business, and they were the 800-pound gorillas. Hamilton obviously was too, but you're exactly right. They price each other out. In terms of Cornell, there was a string of things that happened to the company that were just really bad timing, frankly. So Cornell was founded in 1870 by Paul Cornell and also J.C. Adams. And J.C. Adams is, I would argue, one of the most influential people in American watchmaking, arguably in the world, at least as it relates to modern watchmaking and interchangeable parts, that most people have never heard of. And he founded at least, and I say at least because that's what the literature says, at least 6 watch companies, including Elgin, including Cornell, including Adams and Perry, which became the Hamilton Watch Company. The Hamilton moved into their factory and took a lot of their know-how to do what they ended up doing. So these two found the company in 1870. In 1871, you have the Chicago fire. The Chicago fire wipes out 4 miles of Chicago. It decimates the economy. Chicago makes a quick comeback, but for a startup company with a lot of debt, that was not, it spelled a recipe for disaster. Then you have the Panic of 1873, which was a countrywide crisis. And it really affected the rail lines. And I mentioned J.C. Adams, in addition to Paul Cornell founding the company, they were both involved in the rail lines. So it was really devastating for each of them personally. And Paul Cornell at this time, a lot of the other people that were involved in the company, and you'll see them if you start collecting the pocket watches on the movements. That was just something that the pocket watch companies did. If you're involved with the company, you may be on a movement. They kind of stepped away. So the Chicago fire, Panic of 1873, investors step away. Paul Cornell assumes almost all the company stock. And then in an effort to save the company, he moves the company to California, where it's got more temperate weather. There was a rumor that Paul Cornell also liked to vacation there, like he wanted to move there too. So that could have been part of it too. But there was frankly cheaper labor in California. So they went to California. It survived for another 4 years, and then they sold the company to the California Watch Company in 1876. 1876 was like the same year as the Philadelphia World's Fair, where you mentioned Waltham. That's where the Swiss showed up and saw everything that Waltham was doing because they put it on display. They thought, well, no one's going to be able to replicate this anyways, right? So, but that's the timeline. It only existed 6 years. Now, what I will say though, and what interested me in the company was there was definitely a lasting influence on the people that were involved with Cornell on American watchmaking and global watchmaking, right? So right after J.C. Adams left the Cornell Watch Company, when he left Cornell with most of the company stock, he went to found Adams and Perry in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which I mentioned. This would later become Hamilton, right? The assistant superintendent at Cornell, some 15, 20 years later, would be one of the first Americans to go to Japan as a watchmaker and worked as a manager for the Osaka Watch Company and was influential in creating the first domestically made Japanese watch at the Osaka Watch Company, using the same techniques, the same interchangeable part system that was adopted in 1850 by the Boston Watch Company that was used by Cornell. So there was a lot of people that came off the company, a lot of know-how that had ripple effects on not only the US, but the global watchmaking industry. And so while they only had a 7-year tenure, 6-7 years, depending on how you count it, based on when they started, I think the impact is much bigger. But they were making mainly, to answer your question about if they were high-end or not, they made grades between 7 jewel and 19 jewel. The railroad standard wasn't adopted for pocket watches until some 10 years later. But at the time they were making, and that standard was you had to be 15 jewels, you had to have black Arabic numerals, you had to run 30 seconds per week of deviation, which is pretty incredible for the time. It's pretty incredible now. Many of the Cornell watches at the time were hitting those metrics on the higher end. So they had a number of 15 jewel to 19 jewel models that were used on the rail lines. And so I would say that they had the gamut of watches. The majority that have survived are the 15 jewel to the 19 jewel.
Yeah.
The 19 jewels are relatively rare. We have one of them here. It's called the Paul Cornell, and I mentioned how they would put people's names from the company on the movements. It's stem wind, which is pretty unique for the era. And that's another thing that the Cornell Watch Company did in its short 6-7 year tenure, is that they pioneered the first woman stem winding watch, which at the time was a pretty incredible feat for a startup company. So they made all kinds of watches, but mainly railroad grade watches. In part because J.C. Adams was involved and he had experience from it, in part because Cornell was a railroad man, in the sense that he was an investor in the rail lines. He gave a land grant to Illinois Central Railroad to come to Hyde Park. He had the foresight to do that. So mainly railroad grade, which were at the time higher end.
And so that brings us to your project, which is you took inspiration from, I'm assuming, one of those watches, or maybe
Yeah.
some of those watches. And you mentioned you wanted to start with just like, let's make watches for just the family.
Yeah.
You were hoping to make how many at first?
Just 5.
5, okay.
So we have 5, and they're prototypes. So we denote that on the back. If you on our website, you'll see like a P. I think we did P3, maybe. I don't want to misquote myself, but yeah, we had 5 prototypes, and that was it. And the jump to doing, and this is where the logistics of trying to run a watch company, and also, self-funding a watch company where it's just my wife and I. We do it because we love it. Like it's our hobby, but when it's a hobby, it's also, and it's a real business, then real money starts to get involved, right? And so the jump to doing 10 pieces, which what we did for our first release, required we have to put a movement order in, right? Like the watches aren't, you have to get things in different segments, and the movements take the longest. So there was a leap of faith. It's like, okay, well, now we got to go get movements. And that was scary, because I mean, you have movements, but you have no watch and you have no customers. So you're going off of, like, you hope your friends and family are being honest with you. You hope they're, when you have the watch, when you have the prototypes, you hope that when they're telling you, we really like it, we think other people will like it. When we poll other people, they're like, yeah, we really like it and what you're doing. You hope that's true. And as a brand new company, one thing we did not want to do was take pre-orders and fill people's orders some 6 months later. I just, being a watch collector myself, there is no world in which a brand new company, I've never seen the watch, am I going to, give them half payment up front with a promise like, we will make it. We've never made a watch, but we will make yours. That just wasn't an option for us. So we pre-made all of the watches for our raffle that we just ran. And that was a big leap of faith for us. We're like, we really hope this works. Otherwise, we're gonna have 10 watches, 10 nice watches, but 10 watches. So it started with 5, then we did 10. We sold all of them. We were able to give $5,000 to HSNY through the sale of those 10 watches for watchmaking scholarships. And then we're going to open up build slots for likely another 5 pieces this year. That's sort of the capacity that RGM can handle. And then hopefully a lot more next year. And I say a lot more, like 25 to 50 pieces.
Okay, and are you thinking about different designs, or are you sticking with this design for now?
So right now, we got a ton of interest from the raffle. At current production rates, we've got a 2 to 3 year backlog of people that say they want the watch. It's another thing actually transacting and buying the watch, which we realize. So it's less than that. But we have a backlog of people that really do want the watch and are very interested. So we will continue to make the 1870 CE in the current configuration. But we also anticipate introducing more options in terms of enamel colors, maybe different case materials, maybe different hand materials. but we're going to stick with our current design. We think that the Roman numerals, the way that RGM, the way that we were able to translate them from the pocket watch to the wristwatch, has some staying power, and it's unique, and it's true to American Railroad pocket watches of the 1870s, not only at Cornell but also Rockford, Elgin, all the companies in the U.S. were doing the same thing. So we really like the design. However, we do think that we can iterate quite a bit with colors on, for example, the enamel. We use RGM's enameler. They do fantastic work. It's grand food. They can do nearly any color. We also have access to different case materials, precious metals. So there's a lot of ideas we have, and there's a lot of prototypes we've done. The one thing I'll also say about being a startup, and I would call it, we're a startup micro brand, right? We are, I hope one day we're not. I hope we're bigger, but that's just what we are today. And with that, we have constraints on what we can do and how fast things move. And one thing I wanted to, one of the questions we had talked about prior to this was things that I've learned along the way. And I think the biggest thing is what RGM is doing in Lancaster, Pennsylvania is totally mind-blowing from a watchmaking perspective. And what I mean by that is that there is virtually no, we're working on this, there's virtually no supply chain in the US. And if you talk to any other watchmakers in the US, Josh Shapiro is a great example. He has to just do it himself. And Roland just does it himself, right? And I bring this up because as a startup watch company, you really feel that when you're trying to get things done and over the finish line, right? Because you're only as good as your worst supplier. And so for us, it's like things take a lot of time. Things can be expensive to prototype. And so some great guidance that Roland gave us was like, do a watch and do it well. And then once you have the ability to keep moving, then keep moving. And so right now, our focus is the 1870 CE, doing it right. We think we can iterate on it in terms of the low-hanging fruit. You can envision the 1870 CE with different enamel dial colors that are still grand fou, that are really interesting. That's likely where we're going next. It's low-hanging fruit, and we know we can do it well.
That's beautiful, man. I mean, I just shared a couple of pictures of the watch in the chat, since you were referencing the numerals, and then since you started talking about the movement, the movement is gorgeous. And you mentioned that Roland was sort of advising you. He was like, not just you know, you weren't just a client. It feels like there was somewhat of a more of like he wanted to collaborate and help you with your thinking, and it was a creative partnership in some ways, right?
Absolutely. And
tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I don't come from a watchmaking background, right? I come from, I think where Roland and I really connected was a love of American history, American watchmaking, and collecting pocket watches. Like if you're ever in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Roland's factory now is an old bank, and he's got a vault that's filled with insane pocket watches and wristwatches. Like he's one of the craziest collectors I've ever seen, and especially in American watches and pocket watches. And so I told him, I said, hey, I've been collecting Cornells for 10 years. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately because it's gotten like out of control in some ways. I may have more Cornell pocket watches than anyone in the world. And I would love to meet someone that has more so that I can talk to them about how they got them and the stories behind them. But and that's where we connected. It's like, I love these things. I love the history. I want to make a piece for my friends and family to be able to wear. We can't carry around these pocket watches every day, right? And that's where Roland was like, he offers, and this is a really interesting thing. He offers a custom program, which I've talked to a lot of collectors in Chicago. A lot of people have taken advantage of it, which I think is awesome. But you can go into RGM and he can do just about anything. I mean, he could put a vintage paddock movement in one of his American cases, enamel dial, whatever, anything is possible. He can make pocket watches. He can take a watch that he already has and make a variation of it. So anything's possible. And I said, hey, this is a little bit out of left field. This is not quite what your custom program does, but would you be willing to help me create the Cornell Watch Company? And not so much the company, but the watch.
Yeah.
And he's like, I think that's an awesome project. And this was before it was anything. I mean, this was like, I think it's a beautiful design. It's a classic design. It's something that we can do well. And it was something we both had a ton of fun with. And what I mean by that is like the entire watch is ground up. It's completely new. So the entire case design is brand new to RGM. We iterated that for months. The sizing of the case is completely new. If you see his 801s, which are absolutely gorgeous, beautiful, some of the best watches, I think, for the money in the world, in-house movement, I mean, unbelievable when you start to understand the supply chain issues that he probably ran into. Those are 42 millimeters. So it's a little bit smaller. And it's a brand new movement for RGM as well. So for us, we just got to have a lot of fun. We weren't like terribly price constrained. Time was on our side. We're like, let's just get it right. Let's just have fun with this. And so every piece of the puzzle we iterated on, and spent time doing it. And we both had a great time. So, and then once it hit a point where we're like, okay, I think we're going to invest and make 10 of these. And we're going to be a company. We're going to spin up a website. We're going to start telling our story. That's when he became more of an advisor. And that's when he took his 30 years of knowledge, and he said, this is what I've done. This is what's worked. This is what hasn't worked. Right. And it's just, he's been an invaluable resource. Without Roland, I think the Cornell Watch Company would have failed. Yeah. And because it's so much not just about the watch. There are all these auxiliary things. You can get down a rabbit hole just spending money with no results. There's so many logistics with suppliers. There's landmines everywhere. And our team, myself, my wife, Garrison, our advisors, none of us can bring to the table the knowledge that Roland has, not even collectively. So he's been a true advisor the whole time, starting with just having a ton of fun designing the watch, making something we were both really excited about. And then now, as we try to get bigger and expand and reach more customers and we continue to tell our story, Roland and I have conversations, or when we're engaging media, whatever it may be, I call him, I say, hey, Roland, what do you think about this? Like, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? And he may be like, okay, that's a good idea. Or he'll be like, actually, 10 years ago, I did this. So that is something as a partner, like I just don't, and he's navigating the American market, right? So our team went to Watches and Wonders this year just to sort of see the landscape. We'd never been. We were not featured. We didn't have a booth or anything. We just went and we met some great people. We met the CEO of Studio Underdog. They're doing fantastic work. I don't know if you guys follow them much, but they're doing a lot of great stuff for British watchmaking. We met a lot of Swiss manufacturers, suppliers, component manufacturers, obviously a ton of watch brands. It's a different thing. The Swiss watchmaking industry is much different than what's going on here in the US. And so I bring that up because Roland, being an advisor from the US, serving the US and global markets, but from a US perspective, taking inspiration from a lot of the things that we take inspiration from, he's invaluable. Like we would not be where we are today without Roland. So I can't say enough good things about Roland helping this become a success.
Well, listen, I just have two more things and then we'll open it up for other people's questions. I mean, I have a lot of questions in my mind just from everything that you're saying, but I kind of want to let others speak. I just have to say, there's so much about the design that is done so well, like just even the length of the hands, which is kind of a pet peeve of mine when it's not right. I love how your name is on the micro rotor. you know, it's like this, it's like a little plaque that's sort of bolted
Yeah.
onto the micro rotor. There's just so many design details that I think are amazing. The onion crown, I'm a huge fan of the onion crown. I have a Chrono Swiss
Oh,
one.
nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I love the onion crown. So there are many things when we were talking about doing a chapter watch, it wasn't easy. I mean, we
Oh,
actually haven't gotten there, you know, in terms of getting
yeah.
agreement on what we want. Um, and you know, from colors to things, and you know, even just throwing ideas around, it was funny. We would end up joking because if we actually did those things, it would probably be terrible. So, you know, so yeah, I can imagine that just designing, having Roland there, and then also, you know, having such a clear source of inspiration for what you want to do. It's
Yeah.
beautiful. There's also something about the, what is it called? Like the radial sort of satin finish on the bridges, where
Yeah.
it's like a little bit curved, right? It's like, oh,
Yeah.
it's so much about it is just beautiful. Congratulations. Um, Okay, so we also want to talk a little about like your future plans and then
Yeah.
talk about sort of you mentioned the scholarships, right? So if you're
Yeah.
selling your watches for around $10,000 and you're saying 5,000 goes to the scholarship, is it because you sold five or because explain
Yeah.
the scholarship and then we can talk about, okay, are you planning on doing the lottery sort of model as you move forward? Or what other sort of ideas are you exploring? And then we can talk about the the project about sort of the American watchmaking, supporting American watchmaking. You mentioned Studio Underdog and the work that they're doing in Britain. You know, we've
Yeah.
talked to Chris Ward and all these other brands, and they're all sort of again like coming together to try to see what they can do for British watchmaking. It'd be great to see something like that here. All right, so let's
Yeah.
start with the first question, which is just in terms of what's your next step, right?
Yeah.
Now you've sold out of these watches. What do you plan to do? Oh, one more thing I wanted to say about design that I wanted to point is the logo. I am assuming this is the logo that looks almost like a tulip with
Yeah.
two, yeah,
So the
so beautiful.
logo, is that's our creation. The Cornell Watch Company, on their pocket watches, they use the fleur-de-lis, the tulip motif throughout. So almost all the grades, and especially in the higher grades, you will see that as an embellishment to all of the writing in the Cornell watches. And so that's not their original logo.
Yeah.
They had they didn't have a consistent logo. That's our design, and that was something we iterated with Roland as well. Like he helped make sure that it was right and it fit on the dial. We use a custom font that we designed with RGM as well. And I'll say that like from a design perspective, what's really gratifying for us is the minute details that you're taking notice to. We agonized over for weeks, for months. The hands are a good example. We made a full prototype with the hands that were identical to the pocket watch, right? So the spade hands.
Yeah.
A lot of people have asked, like, why don't you use the spade hands? It didn't look right. You know, just to be frank, like it looked, and we didn't start our first prototype, just said the Cornell Watch Company, like the pocket watches. It had no logo. It didn't say Chicago. It looked really austere. And so that's where you sort of start having to take some liberties. They don't seem like big jumps, but when you deviate from the design of the pocket watch and you try to figure out how can we modernize this while keeping the same aesthetic, that's where it starts to get kind of tricky. And our logo was part of that conversation. I'll also say, as you guys think about designing a watch possibly for the chapter, one thing that like was really helpful with Roland is I would have these thoughts about like, okay, let's do this from a design perspective. Let's maybe use this movement because it might be a little bit thinner, right? Let's do this or that. Having a watchmaker with 30 years of experience that one is available, I can pick the phone up and call him. Anyone can. And that's a beautiful thing about RGM. You can call him and design a custom watch. Like it's incredible. He speaks English, which we do not take for granted anymore. I do not speak French. And so that seems small, but it's not. But Roland would say, okay, that's an interesting design decision. However, technically, can we execute it? And sometimes the answer would be no, right? And so one of the reasons we chose our movement was Roland. We were considering a couple high-end independent movement makers that would supply us. Roland said, I like the serviceability and the robustness of this movement. As a watchmaker, I prefer this movement. And Roland warranties our watches. So I was like, well, there's a thinner movement that he's like, the placement of where the sub-second dial here works better. It looks more akin to the pocket watch, which it does. The dimensions line up perfectly. And he's like, I like the serviceability. So that's why we went with that movement. And it's got great technical features too. And it's a beautiful movement. We love the micro rotor, but that's where a lot of design decisions start to come into place. The way the watch ended up isn't just like our vision as a company being like, this is the watch we want. We landed on a lot of these things because we relied on an expert to be like, the tolerances here aren't going to allow for this. Or we're going to go with this movement over this movement. Or we're going to use box sapphire because the enamel dial is nearly 1 millimeter thick and we need clearances for that, right? So there's all kinds of little things that ended up being beautiful because they're done well, they're executed well by RGM, but it wasn't just, it wasn't us being like, oh, I think that'll look good, or like, let's play around with it. A lot of it was like, technically, is it going to be what we need it to be? So that's a long-winded way of talking a little bit about design.
That was great. That was great.
But I mean, that's why we got into it. Like, that's where, and I hope you guys as a chapter, the one thing is that you're going to have a lot of chefs in the kitchen, and we have a small team, but everyone's got inputs. And we were so lucky to have RGM because Roland would like suss out a lot of the stuff. He'd be like, okay, that's a good thought, but technically it's not going to work. So that's off the table. So we were lucky with that, but the design process was so much fun. Like that's what everyone dreams of, at least our team. Yeah. That's what we get excited about. That's where we're excited to prototype for the next models. But yeah, so that's just a little bit about kind of how I could talk for days about each element and the work stream that led to where we are now, but that's a little bit kind of how the design process worked.
That's awesome. Thank you. Okay, so real quick, the next batch, what model sort of are you thinking? Lottery, something like that, or
so the next batch, we're giving priority to those that entered the raffle. If they want to build, so we're going to do it via build slots. So the watches, we have some more movements on hand, and the watches can take anywhere from 3 to 6 months to make. So what we're going to do is we're going to allocate the next batch via build slots. We're going to reach out first to the people that entered the raffle. If they're not interested in securing a build slot, then we'll open it up to people that weren't in the raffle. But we want to, for people that jumped on board before we sold any watches, we want to make sure they have a chance to have the opportunity to buy a watch in the first year. The unfortunate thing is we only have 5 that are probably going to be available this year. We might have more. We hope to have more. It depends on supply chain stuff. And so if we can have more, we will. But we definitely have 5. And we're going to do that via build slots. We're likely to take deposits for those to secure a build slot. And then, final payment is due when the watch is delivered. For next year, we're likely going to continue with the build slot model. It's really, and Rodrigo, I would be lying to tell you like we're confident on this. That's something we're like, as a new company, things change every day. Like we get more interest here, we get less interest there, and so it's like we've learned not to create artificial deadlines for ourselves. Lots of times, like a lot of the stress that we have in the company is because we've created deadlines that don't need to exist. So we try to avoid that where we can, and we try to be very customer centric. Like we are watch customers ourselves. Like there are things that we like and things that we don't like with companies, and so we try to be really transparent with people. Once we do something, we set it into motion and we stick with it. And so I say that just because I know that we have at least 5 more pieces coming, and we're going to do it via build slot. how next year looks, it's hard for me to say with complete confidence, just because we want to make sure we stick to it, and we are making more watches. We've got suppliers that are ready to go, but it's hard to say with perfect confidence how we're going to allocate those watches. I will say I like the raffle style, not because not for like, it does generate buzz, which is nice, but more so it makes it fair. Like our 10 raffle winners, I don't think, if I were to poll them, I think like 6 or 7 out of 10 of them don't have Instagram. Like they found us through like RedBar or whatever it may be. Like and I don't know any of them, right? Like we've never met. Now I've talked to almost all of them now. But like these people are all across the country, some across the world. We have international clients that won. So we think it's a pretty democratic way to make sure that people get watches. Like we would love it if, Jay-Z won one. He was not in the raffle. So, but we would love it if someone like that won and then they like posted about it, and it would help us. But being someone where I've waited in the Rolex queue for years and like nothing ever came, right? And I've waited in the queue for watches that I've wanted. Like that to me, that's not fun. That's not what this is about.
Yeah.
And so we like the raffle style for that reason.
Yeah.
So for future releases, like different variants, I could see us doing the raffle. Again, it's hard to like commit to it at this point, but for those reasons, I like the structure of a raffle. I think it's fair. And I think it gives everyone a chance. And it also helps us, just being frank, it helps us as a company to try to forecast what the interest is in the watches so that we can prepare for the next phase. Because
it's almost becomes like a validation process, right? Hey,
totally.
we got a lot of people interested in this. Okay, we're good. Now,
Yeah.
just because I want to be mindful of time, and I teased it already that I would open it up for others. Want to get to, you mentioned suppliers who want to work with you. And I feel like that's a good segue into this idea of the American supply chain and how you hope to try to kind of boost it. And I'm assuming part of you mentioned how a lot of design choices were, based on necessity. I'm assuming like a lot of your production decisions are also based on necessity. Like, we can't do more than this number. So maybe the idea of trying to boost the supply chain, it is a way of sort of hoping then to be able to make more watches. So tell us a little bit about that project, and then we'll open it up. The American Supply Chain Project.
Yeah, so something that, and again, it's like Roland is so invaluable with this. Like Roland has suppliers across the world, the US, you name it, right? But something that we learned just trying to navigate this landscape is that the American supply chain does exist, but it's not connected. It's completely disjointed. There are really talented artisans. There are people that are making cases, that are making dials. There are people that are making really intricate movement components. There's people that are doing jewels, right? As you mentioned with Josh Shapiro. So there's people doing these things. And then we also have these big companies in the US that make medical devices, that do microtechnology type of work. So there's companies doing similar work. We have a ton of jewelers to do finishing and whatever it may be. So there's people doing similar adjacent work, but they may not be tapped into the watchmaking ecosystem, right? And there's a bunch of other brands like the Cornell Watch Company in the US that are trying to use US component manufacturers where there's just not linkage. People are speaking different languages in terms of what a watchmaker needs and what a supplier can deliver, like who they normally deal with on a daily basis, right? So that's high level kind of what we saw. And so the Watchmakers of America directory is really like a very basic, simple initiative to us because all we're really doing is putting together effectively a yellow pages or whatever, we're compiling names of component manufacturers, of suppliers that are here in the US that are either making watch components now, and there are quite a few that are. Again, they're just not like widely known, or manufacturers that have the capability to make watch components, where if they got a quantity order from, let's say, multiple micro brands, they could do something at a cost-effective price. So that's all we're trying to do. And we've been working on the initiative for roughly 6 months now. And so we're gathering the suppliers, we're speaking with manufacturers, and we're seeing what's possible. And we hope to soon release a pretty comprehensive list of all of the suppliers and component manufacturers in the US that can be servicing the existing and hopefully future American watch brands. And so it's really as simple as that. It's really just to have a centralized location where other watch brands and we could utilize to find American suppliers and manufacturers.
I have one follow-up question to that because, you mentioned going to Lancaster, right? And
Yeah.
I've hung out with Roland Murphy. I've had dinner with him. I've
Oh, nice.
seen him lecture, and I think he's amazing. And the history there in Lancaster, I toured the Bowman School where he went to school.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, with him and a lot of his fellow alums, classmates. It's amazing. He did like a demonstration of guillocheting a dial, and it's just incredible. He is really a treasure. And we have a lot of treasures like Roland. I think, I've met through RedBar, this man, Bob Frischman. He's more of a clock guy, but he's introduced me to so many people, taken me and shown me so many, wonderful things. I've learned so much from him, including the trip to Lancaster. I went with him. He was lecturing there. There's the school in that's connected to the NAWCC museum, right? Where they're training people. There's the AWCI. Are you connected with either of those? Because I feel like they're doing a lot of work to try to, foster like the next generation of watchmakers and teach the stuff.
Yes, David Lindau and I have had many conversations. He actually, and this is another cause that we're looking at, the Plumier Foundation, where they're building. So the Plumier, what they do is they basically are keeping alive these historic crafts, whether it's guilloche, whether it's engine turning, whatever, it could be case making, whatever it may be. They're trying to make sure that these traditional crafts stay alive. And they provide scholarships, they provide a workplace for people to come and experiment with these things. So that's an initiative we're looking at closely to help support down the road. Right now we're focusing on the scholarships, but we had the cover story of AWCI Horological Times in January. And I talked a little bit about the history, but I wrote a piece for them about the history of Cornell and the influence on global watchmaking, which can be found in that article. But yeah, I really respect what AWCI is doing. I do feel like AWCI has a tilt that's more focused on the profession of watchmaking itself, where it's more of like a technical tradesman type of thing, where the people involved in it are salt of the earth watchmakers, clockmakers, jewelry finishing. So we're plugged in with them, but we do want to do a lot more. Like we think some of the causes,
production.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, for us, if I won the lottery, what I would love to do is I would love to make components ourselves as a Cornell Watch Company. I'd love to make them here in Chicago. Like, I think that'd be fantastic. The Cornell Watch Factory originally hired some 200 people. They made roughly 25 watches a year. They made everything in-house, soup to nuts, the whole thing. They even made the machines that could make the pieces. So we're talking like they did everything. I don't think there's a world where we're doing that, but I would love it if we could bring some production of components back to Chicago, and at the very least, rely exclusively on American manufacturers for suppliers. And so the Watchmakers of America directory starts to get at that, where it's like, we want to know who the players are. We want other watch companies in the US to also be able to use these people, so that we act sort of as a connector. And you mentioned what they're doing in British watchmaking. That's what we want to do here. We want to act, and again, it's like, we're a small company. We don't sell a lot of watches, but what we do have is, right now at least, a platform, and people are listening. And so if they're listening, what are we going to do with it? And we think, based on conversations we had with groups like RedBar, with AWCI, we think that this is probably the best path. Like, this is the return of American watchmaking is not going to happen overnight. Like, there are key things that the Swiss do that allow them to succeed in the way they do, that America right now just does not have at scale. But we can work towards that. Like, it's an iterative thing. And so the Watchmakers of America directory is a very small thing. We hope someone else picks it up and runs with it and is like, oh, we can do this with it, right? Like, we can do that. And so it's just a start. It's get the conversation going, get the ball rolling, and then we compile a list, we get it out to the world, and we see what happens.
Thank you so much, John. All right, now I'll open it up to, Jürgen, Roger, TV, anybody who has any questions for John.
I can jump in if you can hear me.
Yep.
How'd you get your wife to like watches, man? What's the secret?
It's been a journey. So my wife is the CFO of the company. She works in finance, like in her real life. She's a banker, and so I think she understands the business side of it better than I do. And she keeps the lights on, because we're funding this as we go. And so I think as she's learned more about the supply chain, like the work that goes into it, seeing kind of like what Roland does on a firsthand basis, I've kind of won her over. And another key that I've found is almost all my watches are on rubber or leather, and I've got extra holes punched in them. So my watches fit her. They're not on bracelets. So I don't technically own any watches. We share watches. So that seems to help. But yeah, no, it's been a journey. She supports my bad habit. Fortunately, pocket watches aren't terribly expensive either. If I was collecting like vintage Pateks, that'd be a different thing.
Definitely agree, and I think I love pocket watches as well. I collect mostly Longines.
Oh, nice.
Learned a lot from the American watchmakers at the 1887 exhibition, or 1876.
1876, yeah, in Philadelphia. Yeah. They showed up and they were shocked. They were like, "Oh my God!" But then by 1893, which was in Chicago in Hyde Park, the Swiss effectively, Waltham showed up like really, I don't want to say cocky, but they showed up. They're like, "We got this," and they showed up to like play, and they started using those techniques. And so the Swiss quickly were like, "Oh, no, we can do this well." But yeah, a lot of the Swiss blended it in a way that, like, as Rodrigo was talking about, like Elgin and Waltham like kind of put themselves out of business. Like, it was like a race to zero. Where the Swiss are like, we're going to use these techniques to automate some of these things, but then we're going to add our level of Swiss finishing. And so they made higher quality pieces, right? And Longines was a direct descendant of this. I love Longines. I collect some vintage Longines. Since Goldberger went on the Talking Watches, like, God, that was like 10 years ago, like so long ago. Like, I swear, like, prices of vintage Longines has like moved up, but yeah, I still have a few.
Definitely great.
There's a great book with a story of the corporate espionage that the Swiss did when they came to the World's Fair, to the World Expo. And that's fascinating, because they actually recruited people from inside the factories, and then they actually hired some that went back to Switzerland. But it was, you were saying how the Swiss have things that we might not be able to replicate here. They saw that too. They said, what they're doing there, we can't replicate here. So they came up with basically the Swiss model, which didn't really exist in the form that it does today. And Longines was the first like vertical manufacturing, sort of integrated thing, as you said, modeled on what they saw here.
And what's interesting is that not only the pricing of American watch companies kind of killed them, right? But also the way in which they were completely vertically integrated. Right
Yeah.
nowadays, like we see like Amazon, right? And we think like, oh, you want to be totally integrated, like A to Z, like you want to control the whole. With watches like Waltham, like there were summers where they just shut down the factory. They're like, we don't have enough demand. Our factory's too big. We've made too many watches. We hire too many people. And I've been to the Waltham factory. It's massive. And so that was actually one of the biggest components that led to the fall of American watchmaking, is because they were honestly too big. Now the Swiss, and I mention this because we spend a lot of time thinking about the history of American watchmaking and the history of Swiss, German, and Japanese watchmaking to help shape our initiatives. The Swiss had a cottage industry, right, where they were recruiting components from all these cottage manufacturers, right? And so when things really slowed down, they basically just told their suppliers, like, we don't need it anymore. And they would just turn it down. They didn't have all this overhead. They didn't have these giant buildings. And so they were able to say, we're going to scale back. We're going to make less watches. We're going to still be able to keep the lights on. That was a huge problem with American watchmaking. The Swiss got that right.
Yeah.
Like they focused more on like higher end finishing. Like they were doing things that were interesting and unique and complications, where the US was really about just making high quality, reliable timepieces at a good price.
Well, they also like were pricing themselves where they were competing with like dollar watches that weren't of quality, and that was there's a question to be put in the chat. It's actually a two-part question. So I'll pick up the second part first. So he wants to know, are you guys planning to showcase at the Wind Up Fair in Chicago that I think Worn and Wound does?
So we're not at Wind Up this year. We had an article done with Worn and Wound. We're good friends with Zach. We saw him in Geneva. Great guy. The Wind Up Watch Fair is very popular. Like you've got to plan in advance. So hopefully next year, we would love to go. We'd be honored to be featured in it. So we're not going to be in it this year. I see that the second question here. So
more about the collaboration with Roland.
Yeah. So a lot of the work was done virtually. And it's just the nature of, we started in 2021. I think people had kind of gotten accustomed to working that way. And you guys may see my wife in the background. It's beautiful here in Chicago. We're grilling some food for dinner. We mainly did stuff virtually. I've been out to Lancaster several times. When we go to Lancaster, a lot of what we're doing is planning for what we're going to do next. And what I mean by that is like, we set a timeline for things that we want to get done. And there's a lot that has to, like, we have a lot of ideas as to like how we're going to iterate and what we're going to do next and how many watches we're going to make. And so when we meet in Lancaster, that's what we talk about. So last time we were there, we ironed out how many watches we're going to make. We ironed out the timeline, like how long they would take to produce. Then we talked about effectively, like, if we were to get more demand than we're anticipating, what are some of the options? Where are the levers we can pull? So when we meet in person, that's kind of what we talk about. And we may, like, if we have time, like we may, talk about designs. We end up talking about pocket watches, right? So just some more casual stuff too. But most of the design work was iterative, going back and forth. So my computer, I probably have 10,000 emails from RGM on every aspect of the watch, just going back and forth, back and forth, back. So most of it was over email, phone calls, Zooms, virtually. And two, like, as a small company where, again, like my wife and I effectively run it and finance it right now. Like we hope it gets bigger. It's not, I would love to go to Lancaster every week. It's just economically, we don't want to pass costs like that onto customers or anything. So we don't go to Lancaster a ton. It's not easy to get to. But yeah, so it was mainly virtually and on email.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. all of the back and forth has to be done in a more kind of fast, efficient way.
Yeah.
One thing, since you mentioned, and since we're back on the topic of Roland, is would you consider Roland sort of like kind of a partner, because he's your supplier, but it feels like he's more of a partner creatively and also, you know, by advising, and also like the collaboration. It's a Cornell watch, but it's an RGM watch. So
Yeah, they're co-signed.
yeah.
Yeah, we're proud
It's
of
like
that.
an RGM X Cornell or something.
No, it is.
Oh, it is? Okay.
I mean, like if you look at the case back of our watch, it's co-signed by RGM and Cornell. And I think for us, like we've always it's an honor that RGM's involved. There would be no universe in which we could make a watch of this quality without RGM. So, and he took a chance on us. Like we're nobodies in the watch world. Like we love pocket watches. We love collecting. We take an interest in the return of American watchmaking, as Roland does. So like he took a chance on us. And so Roland is way more than just a supplier. He works with us to make things. You notice, I mean, like another thing, like kind of getting in the weeds of like the logistics of starting a watch company. Watch brands, when you work with just suppliers, there's minimum quantity orders. Like you can't put an order for 5 watches.
Yeah.
You can't put an order in for 10 watches. Like you have to put an order in for 200 watches. We don't have proof of concept. We don't know if people actually want the watch, right? So that's one issue. But 2, like that's like a crazy amount of upfront capital, right? And like to do something like we're doing this because we love it. And now it's starting to turn to a business, and we've got to think more strategically and how we're going to grow and all. But like we got into it because we love it. And so Roland, that's where like it's hard to emphasize the level of partnership, because he's worked with us in a way where no other just supplier would do it. Like no supplier would be like, yeah, I'll make you 5. Like we'll prototype for 2 years. I'll spend my time, my resources, my staff, to help you guys build your dream watch, and then we'll just make 5. And if you want to stop there, you can stop there. But I mean, we discussed, we're like, we think people may want these. They may resonate. The story may resonate, and we have a platform. Like there's things we can do to help American watchmaking. So Roland has been much more than just a supplier. He's been integral in the design process, integral in us existing. Like we don't have, you know, huge financial backing on this thing. It's like I wish it wasn't this way, but it's kind of day to day, where it's like, what can we afford to build? What can we do so we're not passing on our inefficiencies to customers? Like, you know, like that's it right now. So Roland has been like, again, we couldn't do it without him. So like we would not be having this conversation if Roland said, hey, it's an interesting project and I like what you guys are doing, but I'm not going to do it. I could not do this reaching out to, like, for example, a white label supplier in Switzerland or the US or wherever. It just would have never happened.
Well, we're glad you did it. We're glad you connected with Roland and you came out with this beautiful watch. I'll definitely be entering the raffle for the next batch if I get lucky, because I can justify the spend by saying, well, I won the raffle. I had to.
You have to, and $500 a watch goes to HSNY for the scholarships, and HSNY. If I can give a plug for them, they are doing fantastic work. Yeah. I mean, their programs are geared towards outcomes. Like their scholarships, like this last year, they gave over 125,000 to scholarships. I think it was 150. And these go directly to watchmakers or aspiring watchmakers in the US. Right now, there's a shortage of 4,000 watchmakers in the US alone. So like they are at the tip of the spear for like trying to correct that. And I mentioned that just because that's why we get $500 a watch. And that's the benefit. Like our watch is expensive for multiple reasons, right? Like enamel dial, hand finishing, fired blue hands, micro rotor movement, hand finishing. So it's a $10,000 watch, but that allows us to say, okay, we can give $500. Whereas if we were selling a $1,000 watch, we can't make that impact. It's just not, you couldn't do it. You'd be out of business in a day. So that's kind of more in the weeds. That's more like the logistics of it, but HSNY is doing fantastic work. So yeah, if you win the raffle, you won. So like you have to do it. And then two, you're giving to a really great cause. And it's helping student watchmakers in the US.
Well, Roger, is Roger still here? Yeah. I want to give you a chance if you have any questions. If not, that's okay. John, once again. Oh, sorry. Somebody?
I have one more question, man. And I
Yeah, please.
I was half joking with my how do you get your wife into watches, but you gave me such a genuine, well thought through answer. I was gonna ask, like, as you think to the future, and obviously, as you've mentioned, it's a long ways away, and you're, thinking more short term right now. Is there a Cornell watch company without Roland? Understanding the supply chain constraints and just the powerhouse that he is as an individual and as a company.
I don't think there is, to be honest.
Yeah,
in one form or another. You know what I mean? So Roland, I don't see it without him being involved in some way. Now, to that end, like, do I see a world in which we're making components in Chicago, and we're doing designs? Maybe we're doing hand finishing on movements. We would love to introduce some of the traditional techniques that American pocket watches used to do for finishing on cases and on movements. Maybe we're making dials, right? Like, so there are things that we can definitely do, but the idea of like running the business, like knowing what to do next, it's hard to like see a world in which he's not helping and advising, and he's also invaluable to guarantee quality on the watches. So like him, for example, the fact that he warranties our watch is, for me as a watch collector, I love micro brands. I don't want to service a micro brand. I don't know how that even works. With us, that was like one of those things where I'm like, if Roland warranties this, like it adds such a level of credibility. It adds an assurance to customers that, like, let's say in 3 years the Cornell Watch Company isn't here, right? Let's say I get hit by a bus or it's just not economically viable. You still have RGM. They'll take care of your watch. Like, and so I mention all these things because, like, there are things that we can do as a company, a ton of things we can do that are totally distinct from RGM. But I think Roland will always, I hope he wants to, and I hope that we can always be involved in some way to make sure we're doing things right.
Absolutely, man. And what I will say is, like, I definitely you can't understate his contributions, but I can't think of the last time I've been, as drawn towards a new design. And maybe it's because I love old pocket watches, but I think, it's one of the rare exceptions to design by committee. You're seeing something that is by enthusiasts, kind of for enthusiasts, and it's just awesome, man. I hope to see a lot more of it. So appreciate what you're doing. We
appreciate that a lot. It means the world to us. Like, we come out, like, it's like we came out of a cave and we're like, we hope people see what we're doing. We hope they like it. Like, we had no idea. Like, we were in the trenches for like over 2 years, just iterating, and like our committee was friends and family, and they're not the best critics. Like, I need someone to tell me they hate it, like, and we didn't get a lot of that. I mean, we got some, but like we didn't get a ton. And so when you come out of it, you're like, I really hope this is right. And that's, again, we've been talking about Roland as an advisor. He's like, he provides a lot of assurances too. He's like, no, this is good. He's like, this is right. So it means the world to us that other people appreciate kind of what we're doing. And they like the design. Like we spent a lot of time on it. And like, it's our baby, right? Like so thank you. We appreciate that.
Absolutely. And I think, you guys are in a really unique spot too, from a storytelling perspective, just because, in terms of American industry, we were kind of undisputably leading the world, in a domestic manufactured product. It's amazing that it's not been capitalized on in, the 21st century to a greater degree than, it has been.
I couldn't agree more. We have the know-how. We do incredible things in the United States, and it's a profession too. And this is a broader conversation about like how do you create high-paying evergreen jobs in the U.S.? Like this is a really good avenue. These are fulfilling jobs. You don't have to go to college. You go to watchmaking school. It's like a trade school. You make a great living. And you do things that are interesting. You get to work with your hands, you get to think. And so just from the perspective of like creating jobs in the US that aren't going to go away, like there's a huge opportunity. I mean, that alone, right? I mean, the US was making hundreds of millions of pocket watches. It's an incredible, they made more watches than anywhere in the world for nearly 100 years. And then it was gone. There has to be a world in which at least a fraction of that can come back. Like we have the know-how, like we have the companies that can do it. We have the people. And so that's a lot of the initiatives we talk about. We're like trying to get these people together and like trying to make it work. And that's one thing people have said to me as like a criticism for the company. They're like, John, you're not a watchmaker. Like, how are you going to get buy-in from people? And with the RGM, I'm like, we work with America's best watchmaker. Like my job is to try to figure out what are the things we can do to help revive American watchmaking. If that's my sole focus, like that gives me a lot of time to figure out like what are the initiatives that we can take. And so I actually think it's a positive. Like I think that there's a benefit to me not worrying about making the watch and me worrying about what can we do to support American watchmaking, right? So but yeah, no, it's really exciting.
I want to just pick up on a few things that you mentioned, talking to Bob Frischman and others who tell me they cannot handle the work. Like they choose not to do more work so that they can have a life, because they say the amount of demand for their skills, whether it's just repair or something a little more entailed, is incredible. And
Yeah.
I can only assume that in the last few years, with the sort of re-blossoming of appreciation for watches and mechanical watches in particular, that it's gotten even more dire, the need for those skills. So we definitely need it, and people need jobs. So you're totally right on that. The other thing with what you were saying about Roland, I think we might need to reach out to Roland and have him do one of these. I think it would be great.
It should.
I mean, I just wanted to say that I agree with you that having, it's almost like you need the two parts of the brain, where Roland is the technical part and he's the, sort of the inside the machine thing. But you also need it, like you talked, especially at the beginning, a lot about how you're a watch, probably wine too. You're a watch lover, watch
Try not to.
enthusiast. And so you're kind of coming at it from that angle. What is the watch experience that I would like to have? Because I don't want to be on a wait list and then not get the call, and all of those things. And also, what watch would I wear? What watch would my family wear? So it's almost like you're getting both. I think that's a really great combination.
Yeah, no, it's worked out. It's worked out pretty well. I will say the one thing about being involved in a small business. We also sell like a really premium product, like $11,000. That's an incredible, like that's a really expensive timepiece. Like no matter which way you cut it, and you have a ton of options at that price point, right? So I would say one thing we do struggle with is that we are a little bit light staffed in the marketing department. Like you sell an $11,000 watch, you kind of need $11,000 watch marketing. We just don't have to. Like we can't afford it. We don't have a marketing person. Like we don't have it. You also have to have like, we don't have a physical location in Chicago yet. We would love to get a boutique, but like we don't have that. Like what other watch brands that are $11,000 don't have that? Now you can go to Lancaster, you can see our watches being made at RGM, but like I will say that like we could use more people and resources to do more. I think any successful company like RGM, these guys are doing, and this is why like I respect them so much, is like they're doing everything, you know, at RGM. They're not just doing what we're doing, where we're doing like the yin and the yang thing, where like I'm a collector. Roland's a collector, you know, he's the collector. Like his collection is insane. He's a watch guy. Like he buys watches from customers, and like he has a resale program and stuff. So like he kind of does it all. I will say that my focus though is different than his. Like he does worry about making watches, right? Where I'm worried about, okay, we got to run this company. We have limited resources. We have to do things right. And what story are we going to tell? Like if we have a platform, what are we going to do with it? And so that is a little bit different, but it's a long-winded way of saying like, we could use more people to help fill some of the gaps.
Sign
But
us up, anything you need.
Yeah, but it's like, it's an impressive feat what Roland's doing. Like, cause he's doing everything we do at a higher level, and he's making world-class watches. So like it's, you know, it's hard to, you guys should get him on because he is a treasure. I do think, I mean, he's making in-house movements. He's making tourbillons in the US. There is absolutely no supply chain for that. Like it's starting to come back, but like it's like no one else is doing this. Like if he was doing that work in Switzerland, it'd be impressive. But doing it here is like a totally different thing. Like he literally has to reinvent the wheel. And he's using like traditional American watchmaking, like his motor barrel, like that's a traditional, uniquely American watchmaking component. So he's doing like crazy stuff. And so anyways, the yin and the yang, I think Roland, if he ran Cornell, like he'd do a pretty good job. Like he'd probably do a better job than I would, because I take a lot of his advice. So, but yeah, no, it's a good partnership. Like we get to focus on different stuff.
Well, listen, John, I want to thank you again for your time, also for sharing your story. I agree with Jorgen. You have a great story. And so, you know, you say for now that we have the platform, what do we want to say? You know, I think you're saying it all with your watches, and also with the way you're going about making your watches and all the heart that you put into it, and with how you want to give back and really help, you know, with the supply chain and the scholarships and everything. You have a great story. And please, you know, count me in for anything that we might be able to do, connect you with people here in the New England area. You talk about all the different watch companies that were in Chicago and in, you know, Illinois and all that area. The list of companies that we had here in New England is incredible. Like when you go down to Connecticut, you know, you still have Timex there. Like it's got, you know, so much stuff. And we have friends who, you know, obviously through the group and other things like that, anything we can do to support. We really, really appreciate your time and everything you're doing.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm always happy to talk. I love this stuff. I hope we get bigger and like we can do more and we can reach more people and we can tell more of a story. So I appreciate you guys. And also like, you know, like we are small. We're nobody yet. I say yeah, because I hope we get bigger, and I appreciate you guys like taking the time to kind of listen to what we're doing before. Like, I mean, we've only sold, you know, 10 watches. So hopefully there's more to come.
Well, you can see from the response you're getting just from those 10 watches that people are interested in responding to your story and to your design decisions. We're really looking forward to whatever you do next, and let us know. We'll stay in touch, and we'll share this video recording with the rest of the group. It could be that many of them just weren't able to join at this time, but thank you
Okay.
so much, John.
Thanks, Rodrigo. All right. Have a
Take
good
care.
one, guys. Good
Thank
meeting
you,
you.
John. Appreciate it.
All right. See ya.